Chapter 1381. Pei Chi-Chi and Tang Yu looked at each other and cursed in their hearts. Their adorable Xiaoxin had been kissed, especially Tang Yu, who had been kissed by the son of his rival in love. And now, the little pervert was lying weakly on the bed. At such a young age, he already had a fragile beauty. When he grew up, he would become a demon. Meeting his gaze, Yi Muyun was not afraid at all. He said calmly, "I just think she's like a little yellow bun, and I want to have a taste." The four adults looked at each other, and then the little yellow bun was about to cry again. "Xiaoxin is not a yellow bun." The little fellow clenched his fists and said fiercely. Yi Muyun looked at the little one, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. "But I've tasted it. It tastes like a yellow bun." Xiaoxin looked at Tang Yu eagerly, and then the little girl plunged into Tang Yu's arms. "Daddy!" Xiaoxin's plump little body hugged Tang Yu tightly, and she cried very sadly. Daddy's embrace was the warmest when she was the saddest. Tang Yu looked at her and found it funny. After a while, he chuckled and said, "Xiaoxin, don't cry. Daddy is here." Xiaoxin turned her head and said, "I want to eat him." A fanatical look appeared in Yi Muyun's eyes, and he looked at Xiaoxin motionlessly. Xiaoxin was frightened again, and she did not make a sound in her father's arms. Tang Yu smiled and looked at Yi Muyun. "He's not a yellow bun. How are you going to eat him?" "I bit him, and he tasted salty." Xiaoxin rested on the side of her father's neck, and her voice was soft and tender. "Xiaoxin likes to eat salty things." Sigh. It was really bloody. Tang Yu looked at Qin Anlin and his wife and sighed. "They're still young, let's just forget about it." One was crying, and the other was bleeding. It was hard to tell who was at the losing end. In fact, Qin Anlin knew very well that his youngest son liked her. What little milk bun? Wasn't it just because the little girl was cute and had a milky scent on her body? That was why he wanted to eat it? They all knew little Mu Yun's character. He wasn't very enthusiastic about anything. Up until now, he had only taken a fancy to this little yellow bun. From the bottom of his heart, Qin Anlin would not refuse. It was Chi-Chi's baby. However, he was not stupid enough to agree, especially in front of Lianxiu. Otherwise, he probably would not have a good life, and this marriage would not go through. After Tang Yu and Pei Chi-Chi left with Xiaoxin, Lady Qin somehow got the news that little Mu Yun was bleeding, and she actually rushed over. It could be seen that little Mu Yun had a place in Lady Qin's heart these days. Lady Qin was cold on the outside, but warm on the inside. Little Mu Yun was an exception. Looking at the little guy lying on the ground weakly, Lady Qin obediently coaxed him for a while. At this time, little Mu Yun was lying in Lady Qin's arms, and the beauty of weakness was displayed to the extreme. If Qin Anlin and Yi Lianxiu had not seen the scene of his little heart against the wall, they would have thought that he was a shy child. But after seeing it, Qin Anlin looked at Yi Lianxiu and touched his nose. He was born to be an actor. Yi Lianxiu glanced at him. This little movement was seen by Lady Qin, and she shouted at the two big ones, "You're still in the mood to flirt with each other." She was so angry. Chapter 1382. Qin Anlin looked at his mother and smiled. It was an accident. He paused for a moment. And it's also Mu Yun bullying the little girl. Lady Qin knew that Tang Yu and Pei Chi-Chi had left. She looked at Qin Anlin. Did he bully the chubby little guy from Tang Yu's family? Qin Anlin didn't say anything, which meant that he admitted it. Lady Qin snorted. If the upper beam is not straight, the lower beam will be crooked. Yi Lianxiu pursed her lips and smiled. Qin Anlin was speechless. He touched his nose and glared at her. "Did I say anything wrong?" Lady Qin snorted. "Look, little Mu Yun used to be such an introverted child. He was good at first, but he must have been influenced by you." Qin Anlin smiled bitterly. "Mom, he was just fooling around." "What about you? Are you fooling around too?" Lady Qin sneered. Qin Anlin didn't say anything. Neither did Yi Lianxiu. At this moment, Lady Qin calmed down. "Be careful in the future. Don't let my precious grandson learn from you." Qin Anlin smiled. "Then old madam will teach Mu Yun. Old madam will be at ease this way." "Anlin, every time you call me old madam, you don't have good intentions." Lady Qin exposed him bluntly. Why? Do you want to throw your son to me and have some alone time? Qin Amlin touched his nose again. How can I do that? He paused for a moment. I just want old madam to be happy and have someone to accompany her. I'll go to see him when I'm lonely. Lady Qin didn't want to pay attention to her lecherous son. She turned to look at Yi Liangxiu and said, When Mu Yun is free, come to my place directly. I have something to tell you. These were probably the rules of the Qin family. Yi Liangxiu was not a naive girl. She smiled and said, Mu Yun should stay here for a night. That way, he can be at ease. She didn't flatter Lady Qin, and she didn't please Lady Qin. She wasn't very likable. Moreover, it was obvious that they were going against him. Lady Qin was unhappy, but she couldn't do anything about it. Besides, her disappointing son was still looking at her. In all fairness, Yi Liangxiu was also a little amazed by her. She had thought that a cold and aloof female celebrity like her would put on airs in private, but Mu Yun liked to stay in his mother's arms. Looking at him like this made her feel soft. In the past, the words little wife were used to describe petite women, but Yi Liangxiu was so tall that it didn't seem out of place to use it on her. Lady Qin looked at her son's gaze. His eyes were full of affection, and she felt a little upset. Anlin had been through a lot of flowers, but he had fallen into Yi Bingxiu's hands. No matter how unhappy she was, she could only accept it. Moreover, she really liked Mu Yun now. Lady Qin blushed and coughed lightly. There's nothing to say. Since Anlin wants to marry you, there are some things I have to tell you. Otherwise, outsiders will say that I'm treating you badly. Qin Amlin squeezed Yi Liangxiu's palm. What he meant was, since my mother has already said so, you should at least take a step back. She glanced at him and then smiled slightly. Old madam is very good to me. Lady Qin coughed lightly and didn't say anything else. She felt that the situation was hopeless. Who asked her son to like her? However, when they arrived at the Qin family mansion, Lady Qin's attitude was unexpectedly good, mainly because she doted on her grandson. Chapter 1383. After the meal, Lady Qin looked at Yi Liangxiu. Although she was a little cold, she was still kind. Follow me upstairs. Her voice was quite majestic. Yi Liangxiu looked at Qin Anlin. He looked at her with some mockery. Afraid? She was not afraid. Yi Liangxiu snorted and followed Lady Qin upstairs. Lady Qin's bedroom was antique. There was no aura of a strong woman. Seeing Yi Liangxiu looking at it, Lady Qin glanced at her. You have never seen the world. Yi Liangxiu was used to Lady Qin's sharp tongue. She didn't take it seriously. She smiled lightly. It's quite elegant here. Lady Qin's eyes were a little gentle. It was like this when I got married. It hasn't changed for more than 30 years. But the people are gone. Yi Liangxiu looked at her. Forget it. Let's not talk about it. Lady Qin opened an expensive lacquer cabinet and took out a jewelry box from it. Judging from the color of the box, it was a treasure. Lady Qin put it in her hand, stroked it, and then opened it. There were 5 layers inside, and there was a set of jewelry on each layer. Even though Yi Liangxiu had been in the Vanity Fair for so many years, she was still dazzled at this time. A set of diamonds, a set of rubies, a set of sapphires, a set of pink diamonds, a set of emeralds. The luster dazzled her eyes. Every piece was a treasure. Just in this box alone, there were more than 1 billion yuan. Mrs. Qin glanced at her and said indifferently, You're so petty. Yi Liangxiu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This was more than 1 billion yuan? Okay. Lady Qin put it in her hand like giving cabbages. This is a meeting gift. I will give you something else when we get married. I forgot where I put it. I will ask Qingxiu to find it later. Yi Liangxiu was in a dilemma. It didn't seem right to accept it or not. Lady Qin glanced at her. You're from a humble family. So ignorant. She pressed the things on Yi Liangxiu's hand. Even Mu Yun knows how to call her grandma. Is it hard for you to call her mom? His voice was fierce, but it carried a faint trace of desolation. Yi Liangxiu did it for no other reason than that Mrs. Qin wanted her to call her mom. She had not called her mother for a long time. She lowered her eyes and looked at the box. After a long time, she said, Thank you, Mom. Lady Qin smiled and sighed for a long time. Then she said, Amlin finally has a family. My wish has been fulfilled. As she said this, she added, he and Pei Chi-Chi are just playing house. It doesn't count. In fact, as a mother, she could see clearly that if Amlin really had something going on with Pei Chi-Chi, Tang Yu would definitely tear Amlin apart. Now, they would smoke together occasionally. Yi Lianxiu didn't know what to say after she said this. She didn't say anything for a long time. Lady Qin coughed softly. Don't worry about this. Men, especially perverts like Enlon, would more or less make some mistakes. I will be faithful to you in the future. Yi Lianxiu nodded. The way she held the jewelry box made Lady Qin uncomfortable. You are a celebrity. Why are you so greedy? Because it was a gift from Mom? Yi Lianxiu bit her lip, but a smile appeared on her face. Of course it's different. Her words made Lady Qin happy. Although she was happy, her old face still sank. You have a glib tongue. I'm telling the truth. At this moment, Yi Lianxiu felt that Mrs. Qin was actually quite cute. She said one thing, but meant another. She said she didn't want it, but her actions were honest. Chapter 1384. Lady Qin looked at her. I didn't learn much from Amlin, but I learned a lot of sweet words. She patted her hand as she spoke. Yi Lianxiu was a little flattered. All right, you can go now. Otherwise, Amlin will think that I bullied you. The old lady snorted and said stubbornly, let me tell you, you're still far from being my ideal daughter-in-law. Looking at the old lady's duplicity, Yi Lianxiu's mouth was a little dirty. Amlin is also far from being my ideal husband. Give it back. Lady Qin was a little childish, asking for her treasures as if they were playing house. She had given away more than 1 billion yuan, but she didn't even hear a word of praise. She was so angry. Yi Lianxiu chuckled. It's mine now that I've given it to him. Lady Qin looked at her and said, good for you. Although her words were not pleasant to the ear, she was much better than Wang Kaiyun. At least apart from Mu Yun, Lady Qin would also care about her. She would not be left out. That was enough to make her satisfied. That night, little Mu Yun was left at the Qin family's old house. Lady Qin was worried about Qin Anlin. She was afraid that he would only care about himself and ignore his son at night. So she decided to take care of little Mu Yun herself. On the way back, Qin Anlin looked at Yi Lianxiu in the rearview mirror and smiled. What did Mom give you? Yi Lianxiu held the box and sighed. If I had known that I could get so much by marrying you, I wouldn't have become a movie queen. Qin Anlin smiled. Lianxiu, I know my mother very well. He held the steering wheel with both hands and looked straight ahead. He said casually, although she doesn't agree with you verbally, she agrees with you from the bottom of her heart. Lianxiu, if you didn't have the Empress halo, I don't think she would have given this box to you so easily. He stroked his chin and said, at least wait until Mu Yun is 10 years old. What about you? Yi Lianxiu looked at him. If I wasn't the movie queen, would you want to marry me? Me? Qin Anlin smiled faintly. The most regrettable thing in my life is that we missed 6 years. After he said that, there was silence in the car. Yi Lianxiu didn't say anything. What's wrong? Qin Anlin smiled happily. Are you moved by my deep love? She looked at his back and said after a while, I was defeated by your shamelessness. Qin Anlin smiled even more happily. The car slowly drove on the brightly lit street. When they reached a red light, he suddenly turned his head and reached out to hold her hand. Sit in front. Yi Lianxiu looked at him in surprise. He used some force to drag her to the front. Qin Anlin, what are you doing? Her voice was soft and light with a smile. He held the steering wheel with one hand and held her face with the other. He kissed her and said, I want to kiss you. Lianxiu, respond. The green light is about to turn green. Yi Lianxiu was stunned for a moment. Then she couldn't help but laugh and bite his lips. Shameless. He looked into her eyes, and there was an unusual brightness in his eyes. Even a cold person like Yi Lianxiu didn't dare to look into his eyes. She cleared her throat and said, Drive carefully. Drive faster and go home early, okay? As he spoke, he could not help laughing. My mother has never been so understanding. Chapter 1385. I'm glad that you still think I'm good in your eyes. Qin Anlin smiled, held her hand, and started the car. His heart was soft even in the dark night. He looked at her as if he had been poisoned with the most potent drug, wanting to pounce on her at any moment. Yi Lianqiu stroked the box in her hand and snorted. I don't think you're as cute as this. Ms. Yi, I'm your movable property. He chuckled. Yi Lianqiu suddenly said, do I need to sign a prenuptial agreement? She knew that King Entertainment was not only a management company, but also owned hundreds of first-class clubs. King Entertainment's assets were worth hundreds of billions. She asked but didn't get an answer. Qin Amlin's slender fingers turned the steering wheel, and he switched lanes. When he stopped at the apartment building, he turned around. I'll ask Ham to prepare it, and come to my office tomorrow to sign it. Yi Lianqiu looked at him with tears in her eyes. Qin Amlin pinched her face. Are you angry? He smiled. I didn't expect Xiao Qiuqiu to be such a money grubber. I'm not. She was a little upset. She didn't know why. He hugged her and whispered in her ear, I know you care about me the most. Lianqiu, I know you love me. No. She glanced at him again and hugged herself to stop him from doing anything. She opened the car door and wanted to get out, but she was so nervous that she forgot to unbuckle her seatbelt. She bounced back, looking a little embarrassed. She heard Qin Amlin's chuckle. She leaned back in the seat and glared at him. How can you be so cute? He unbuckled her seatbelt and closed the car door when she tried to escape. He trapped her with his body and chuckled. Are you afraid? Yi Lianqiu stared at him and said, I'm not afraid. Qin Amlin, let me get out of the car. I'm not letting go. He bent an arm in front of her and pressed her down. It seems that we're not in the car yet. She blushed and reached for his hand. I don't want to do it in the car. Then let's go home? Qin Amlin smiled and kissed the corner of her mouth. Do you like the sofa, bed, or bathroom? He was utterly shameless, and only then did she realize that she had been fooled. Yi Lianqiu glared at him. Qin Amlin smiled happily. Or does Lianqiu like to be on the balcony? He was determined not to let her off tonight. She turned her face away and snorted. I don't like any of them. He opened the door on his side and got out. After closing the door, he came to her side and carried her out. Qin Amlin. She was a little panicked and hurriedly hugged his neck. Your injury. Don't mess around. He had indulged himself too much. He had just been discharged from the hospital and had not rested since yesterday. Today, he had even transfused his blood to little Mu Yun. He kissed her with the tip of his nose. I'm full of energy when I see you. He carried her, and she carried her 1 billion yuan, and they went home together. To her surprise, he didn't make a move immediately. Instead, he asked her to take a shower first. Yi Lianqiu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was like letting out some fresh air before death. After she finished showering, she put on her bathrobe and came out. The whole bedroom was dark, but there was a faint yellow light on the balcony. What the hell was he doing? Chapter 1386. Seeing her come out, he patted the seat beside him. Come and sit. She sat over and was carried onto his lap. Then, he magically conjured a bouquet of white roses and cleared his throat. This is for you. She held it and sniffed it. Is this a proposal? You want me to kneel? He looked at her. If it was in the past, Yi Lianqiu probably wouldn't have done it. But now that he had said it himself, why would she still feel sorry for him? So she chuckled. Kneel then. You're the one who made me kneel. He chuckled and slowly knelt down. Yi Lianqiu looked down at him from above, bit her lips, and gave him a kick in a rather willful manner. She was more or less spoiled and spoiled, but her leg was caught by him. His long and strong hands held her and slowly lifted her up. She was stunned. Then she screamed, Qin Amlin, you're the one who said to make me kneel. He smiled devilishly. She used her other leg to kick him, but was restrained again, Qin Amlin. This time, her voice was extremely fragile. Don't do this. It's dirty. He leaned close to her ear. I don't think it's dirty. He gave her a firm kiss. When it ended, her body was trembling. For a long time, she couldn't come back to her senses. He kissed her with his thin lips. His voice was hair-raising. Lianqiu, it's your turn. She glared at him, but he changed the direction of his kiss. She was the one kneeling there. Be good. You'll like it. He reached out and pinched her little mouth. Be good? Yi Liangxiu had never felt so helpless in her life. She took the initiative to lie in his arms and said pitifully, Qin Anlin, I don't know how. Was she willing to do it just like that? His heart softened. He pulled her into his arms and whispered into her ear, I'll teach you. She looked at him and bit her lip. He taught her badly, but she didn't have the cheek to learn. In the end, she had to make it up to him. When he finished, it was already late at night. Her body was limitless. When she was half asleep, she heard him ask, Liangxiu, do you like it? She was extremely sleepy. She knew that if she didn't tell him what he wanted to hear, he wouldn't let her go. Thus, she snored softly. Qin Anlin smiled and ran his fingers through her black hair. Then, do you love me? This was the insistence of a straight man. He wanted to hear her say this. Yi Liangxiu slowly opened her eyes and looked up at him. Really, I can't fool you? He smiled and looked at her sober eyes. Holding her little face with both hands, he played hard. Say you love me. Otherwise? Her eyes were like water. Qin Anlin paused for a moment, then coughed softly. Otherwise, I won't let you off. Sure, come on. She propped one hand up and supported the back of her head. Her finger gently brushed across his heart, from top to bottom. It was quite seductive. Let me see how amazing President Qin is. She moved up and lay in his arms like a little beast, kissing the corner of his mouth. The way her eyes looked made the beast blood in Qin Anlin's body boil. His fingers gently stroked the place where she had just accepted him. He smiled softly. This is the first time our Liangxiu has taken the initiative. How can I let you down? That night, he turned into a beast and let Liangxiu know what it meant to do it 7 times in one night. And it was only then that Qin Anlin knew what it meant to have his soul devoured as bones. Chapter 1387. Qin Anlin pinched her chin and said seductively, Liangxiu, say that you love me. Initially, he didn't really want to hear it. Or rather, he didn't have the confidence to do so. How could someone like him deserve her love? But a lover would always make one greedy. He wanted to hear her say that she loved him. Or perhaps he had never felt safe. Yi Liangxiu lay on the bed. Her long hair was spread out hopelessly, and her eyes were slightly closed. She bit her lip. Qin Anlin, she bit her lip so hard that it almost bled. She couldn't say it, and he felt a little sorry for her. He placed his finger on her lip and said, Stop biting, but he still didn't let her go. He wanted her to say that she loved him. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She hugged him and whispered a few words in his ear. At that moment, his body stiffened. Then, he felt a little embarrassed. He let out a long breath. Looking at the woman in his arms, he smiled. Finally, she belonged to him completely. He grabbed his watch and looked at it. It was already 7 o'clock. He still had a meeting in the morning, so he kissed her face. I'll go to the meeting later. You sleep until noon for lunch. I'll prepare it for you, okay? She hammered him. He was such a beast. He could still go to work. Yi Liangxiu felt that she couldn't provoke him in bed in the future, because it wouldn't end well. Qin Anlin was actually a little exhausted. After all, a night of fun was very tiring. He kissed her and got up to take a shower. He then made lunch for her and put it in the fridge. He ate breakfast and changed his clothes. He put on his tie as he walked to the bedside. She was already in a deep sleep. He smiled silently and bent down to kiss her face. Feeling uncomfortable, she stretched her hand out of the blanket and slapped his handsome face. Qin Anlin was stunned for a moment, but he quickly smiled and kissed her again. This time, she didn't hit him. Instead, she let out a soft moan and naturally wrapped her arms around his neck. His heart softened. He pinched her face and said, Liangxiu, I have to go. I won't let you go. She smiled a little mischievously. So she was faking it. His fingers reached into the quilt as he unbuttoned his shirt. You didn't have enough fun? Then I won't leave, okay? Come again? She released him at once and looked at him with an appalling look. Qin Anlin chuckled. If you want it, you might have to wait until tonight. Liangxiu, I'm a little exhausted. She blushed and buried herself in the quilt. He hugged her and kissed her. Okay, I have to go. Don't forget to go to the company in the afternoon. She made a sound of agreement and poked her head out. He ruffled her hair and was reluctant to leave. After he left, Yi Liangxiu slept until 2 in the afternoon. After eating the food he cooked, she actually felt a little sweet in her heart. When she went out, she chose a white BMW, which was quite low-key. When she arrived at King Entertainment, she didn't inform him and went straight to the top floor to look for him. But she didn't expect to bump into her old friend, Immerse Xiaoqi. Immerse Xiaoqi had been doing well these 2 years and still had the title of Asia's Little Diva. Originally, Yi Lianqiu was planning to make a comeback, but she didn't make it even after a long time. Although there was news of her marriage to President Qin, King Entertainment didn't release any official information. Chapter 1388. When Yi Lianqiu was about to go to Qin Anlin's office, Immerse Xiaoqi was about to go to the conference room. Seeing Yi Lianqiu coming over, she sneered. Does a person who has been frozen by the company still need to attend a meeting? Her face was full of sarcasm, and her meaning was clear. Yi Lianqiu looked at Immerse Xiaoqi and pursed her lips. Did someone tell you that I'm here for a meeting? Immerse Xiaoqi gripped the thing in her hand tightly. So, you're here to seduce men? Before Yi Lianqiu could say anything, Immerse Xiaoqi sneered. Don't think that I don't know what you've been doing for the past 2 years. Living with a man called Lin Xingyuan. What? You came crying to President Qin after being dumped. You know a lot. Yi Lianqiu sneered. Immerse Xiaoqi looked at her. Of course, but don't think about being the female lead now. You're more like a second or third female lead. At your age, you should have some self-respect. Don't think that you're still a little girl. Yi Lianqiu looked at Immerse Xiaoqi and chuckled. So 26 is a pretty old age. Immerse Xiaoqi, how would you describe someone in their early 30s? You. Immerse Xiaoqi was a little angry. She raised her hand and was about to swing it down. How dare you say that about me? She was the big sister of King Entertainment now. Yi Lianqiu really thought that was the past. Immerse Xiaoqi, what are you doing? The one who spoke was Ying Jie. She was standing next to Qin Anlin. The meeting had just ended and the company's executives were at the door. The moment they opened the door, they saw Immerse Xiaoqi about to hit someone. Immerse Xiaoqi's heart skipped a beat. She immediately let go and said coquettishly, she was the one who provoked me. Ying Jie, it's not like you don't know that I never provoke others, especially those who are past their prime. Ying Jie didn't give her any face. She snorted. Are you saying that Lianqiu is past her prime? Ying Jie's words shocked Immerse Xiaoqi. In a sense, Ying Jie's words were the wind vein, which directly showed Qin Anlin's attitude. Feeling uneasy, Qin Anlin said faintly, Yi Lianqiu will never be popular again. Immerse Xiaoqi was overjoyed. This is what President Qin said true? But she didn't have the chance to be happy for long. Qin Anlin continued, in the future, Yi Lianqiu will be an important director of King Entertainment. I will transfer 10% of the 60% under my name to Yi Lianqiu in my husband's name. He looked at Immerse Xiaoqi. In that case, is there anything else you want to ask? Husband? 10% of King Entertainment? Immerse Xiaoqi was stunned. Was President Qin really going to marry that woman, Yi Lianqiu? She didn't want to admit that she wasn't as good as Yi Lianqiu. What was so good about Yi Lianqiu? She was cold and didn't have any personality. She didn't know how to act coquettishly and didn't know how to please President Qin. She would only make President Qin angry. She was obviously frozen. How could she still get married? In her shock, Immerse Xiaoqi forgot her identity and blurted out, President Qin, do you know that she has been living with a doctor for the past 2 years? Such a woman isn't worth marrying. Qin Anlin looked at Immerse Xiaoqi and then at Ying Jie. The meaning in his eyes was clear. Ying Jie understood. Qin Anlin said faintly, Dr. Lin is my son, Yi Muyun's personal doctor. Is there a problem with him living at home? Son? Once again, Immerse Xiaoqi was stunned. They had a son. Chapter 1389. Your concern is misplaced. Qin Anlin didn't look at her anymore and held Yi Lianqiu's hand. Let's go to my office. Then he turned to Kaim and said, bring the documents in. Kaim nodded. Immerse Xiaoqi was embarrassed. She had just offended the future CEO's wife. What's more, Yi Lianqiu was going to be a director soon and her boss. But no one paid any attention to her. Only Ying Jie warned her, you should know what to do in the future. Mo Xiaoqi's body went cold. Yi Lianxiu wouldn't let her go. She wouldn't. Qin Anlin closed the office door and kissed Yi Lianxiu for a while. When it was over, he kissed the corner of her lips reluctantly. Mrs. Qin, are you satisfied now? What do I have to be satisfied about? She pinched his waist. You were satisfied when you were with her, weren't you? Qin Anlin smiled bitterly. How many years has it been? You still remember it? Like a sharp-on stabbing. She poked his heart with her slender fingers. You have so many dark histories. Now that I think about it, I regret it. He chuckled. There's no use regretting it. He circled his arms around her and led her to the sofa. Just then, Khan brought the documents over. Qin Anlin raised his hand and gestured for him to leave. Khan knew that Yi Lianxiu could be considered President Qin's true love. President Qin of King Entertainment had to have absolute control, so 10% was all he could give. Not only that, all of President Qin's real estate was transferred to Miss Ye's name. It was true love. Khan left, leaving only Yi Lianxiu and Qin Anlin in the office. She thought what he said before was a joke, but when she opened the documents, she was stunned. She knew what 10% of King Entertainment meant, tens of billions in assets. Not to mention those immovable assets. They were probably worth more than 10 billion. I don't want it. She looked up at him. It's too much. We're married, so it's not that much. Qin Anlin smiled, held her hand, and half forced her to sign. Yi Lianxiu raised her head and said softly after a long while, Qin Anlin, why? Lianxiu, this is not compensation. He hugged her and rested his chin on her hair. It's joint property, huh? She looked at the signature on it. If one day you dare to... What? I'll run away with the money. He looked at her deeply and said a good word. Qin Anlin. She glared at him. He smiled and hugged her. Of course not. What he didn't tell her was that in his mind, sex was important in a marriage. How could he have anyone else when he wanted her body so badly? Let's go take photos later. And go pick out a wedding ring. He hugged her. I'll go to the meeting first. He was really busy. Yi Lianxiu grabbed him and raised her hand. I have one. He looked at her with a half smile and chuckled after a while. Missy, I don't have one. Go buy a pair of wedding rings, huh? She was a little embarrassed. Qin Anlin pinched her face again and went out. When he came back, Yi Lianxiu had fallen asleep on the sofa, and the 20 billion worth of documents she had signed was messed up. He looked at it quietly for a while and then laughed silently. She had called him greedy. She obviously didn't take it seriously. However, he felt extremely comfortable. Chapter 1390. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Her eyes were a little loose, which was quite cute. You're drooling. His fingers scratched her head, and he smiled. She instinctively wanted to wipe it away, but he laughed even more. Silly. He reached out and hugged her. Go take a shower. After the photo shoot, let's go eat and watch a movie. She looked a little dazed. Aren't you very busy? No matter how busy I am, I have to find time to fall in love. He liked to pinch her face and pat her. Go. Yi Lianxiu's face was a little hot, and she ran to the washroom. She splashed some cold water in front of the mirror and looked at the woman in the mirror. Was this her? Her cheeks were a little red, and her eyes were like a pool of autumn water. She looked like she was in love. At this moment, a pair of hot hands hooked around her waist. You look very nourished. She put her hand on her waist and patted him. Don't mess around again. His face rested on her shoulder. He chuckled and looked at her in the mirror. Didn't I say that I'll only have it at night? Yi Lianxiu snorted. I don't want it. Then I'll let you beg me at night. He had always been as shameless as he could be. Yi Lianxiu bit her lip and stared at him. Beg me. He kissed the back of her neck. His voice was already hoarse, and she could also feel the changes in his body. It was so hot, so hot. Beast. She couldn't help but scold him. She really couldn't stand his knee day in and day out. Qin Anlin bit her earlobe. My surname is Qin. I don't mind if you call me Beast in private, but his fingers circled around her and gently caressed her red lips. I will make this word live up to its name. Her eyes became even more watery as she stared at him in the mirror. But even if she stared at him, there was an indescribable tenderness, Qin Amlin couldn't help but hold her little face in his hands and turn his face to kiss her. They kissed for a long time. Her neck felt like it was going to break, but he still didn't let her go. Liang Xiao, tidy yourself up, otherwise I'm afraid I'll change my mind. His voice was incredibly hoarse as he suddenly let go of her. Her legs gave way, and he quickly hugged her. When she steadied herself, he chuckled. Useless little thing. I'm not a little thing. She glared at him. Don't give me that. Why not? He turned her around and kissed the corner of her mouth. It's quite small. She glared at him. Qin Amlin. He knew that she was actually very shy. So he coaxed, all right, I won't tease you anymore. He went out to let her tidy up, and then took her to take pictures. In the evening, they ate dinner and watched a movie like an old couple. On the way home, Lianqiu sat in the car and looked at him. Why do I feel that being in love is very normal? Qin Amlin fastened his seatbelt slowly and smiled. What else? Shouldn't it be very sweet and exciting? She had the heart of a young girl for the first time. Qin Amlin sighed, and his eyes were a little clear. Lianqiu, we've known each other for 6 or 7 years, and our child is already 7 years old. He rubbed his chin with his slender fingers and chuckled. Lianqiu, most of our fun should be in the bedroom. Carnivore. She looked at him. Qin Amlin chuckled and pinched her face. Go home? I want to take a walk outside. She pointed ahead. The road ahead is quite quiet. Chapter 1391. 10 minutes later, he stopped the car by the roadside, got her out of the car, and held her hand. She was wearing a long white dress and looked like a fairy in the night. At this moment, Qin Amlin felt a little sweet. When they reached a place where there were fewer people, he pressed her against a tree trunk and kissed her. Her long hair fluttered in the breeze and wrapped around his body and his heart. After a long while, he raised his head and looked at her deeply. He had never thought that one day he would be in such a good mood. He was just casually walking on the road, and his mood was so good. He rubbed her lips with his finger, smiled, and held her hand as they walked forward. There was a small park in front of them. Many people came to enjoy the cool air at night, and it was very lively. Lianqiu looked at it for a while and looked up at him. I haven't had such a comfortable life for a long time. If you like, I can accompany you to walk often. He smiled. She looked at him. Didn't you say that our fun is mainly in the bedroom? He smiled and pinched her face. I have to care about your feelings, right? An equal exchange. As he said that, he looked at her a little straight. He frowned and looked in the direction of her gaze. Lin Xingyuan was standing opposite her. He was wearing a sports attire and looked like he was running at night. Lin Xingyuan was about 10 meters away from them. He looked at their fingers that were holding each other's hand and saw them smiling at each other happily. He forced a smile. Lianqiu. His eyes were filled with bitterness and even pain. Xingyuan. Lianqiu suddenly let go of Qin Amlin, and there was some uneasiness in her eyes. Qin Amlin frowned, but he quickly tightened his grip on her hand. She struggled, but couldn't break free and glared at him. Qin Amlin actually stared back at her childishly. Lianqiu couldn't do anything about him, and could only let him hold her hand. She looked at Lin Xingyuan. Why are you back in City B? We're here for an industry summit. About a week or so. He said that while looking at her eyes, as if Qin Amlin didn't exist. Qin Amlin touched his nose and held it in. Lianqiu thought for a while. Let's have a meal together when we have time. Muyan misses you too. What about you? These 3 words lingered on the tip of Lin Xingyuan's tongue for a long time, but he couldn't say it out loud. After a long time, he smiled. Okay, I'll call you then. Lianqiu nodded and said goodbye to Lin Xingyuan. He really didn't want Qin Amlin to lose face on the sidelines. When she was talking to Lin Xingyuan, he would touch her hair and tug at her clothes. He was even more childish and ridiculous than a child. Back in the car, she glared at him. Qin Amlin, you did that on purpose, didn't you? He put his hands on the steering wheel and rubbed his fingers slowly. He smiled and said, Can't I be jealous when my wife sees an old man? You're unreasonable. She snorted and stared at him. How can I not be jealous when my wife sees an old man? You're unreasonable. She snorted and stared at him. How rich is your love history? However, His gaze suddenly turned dangerous. He held her waist with both hands, and his eyes were burning. You and him, how far have you progressed? The tip of his nose touched hers, and his dark eyes were locked on her, not letting go of any expression on her face. Yi Lianxiu was furious. She hit him and said, I haven't settled the score with you yet. How dare you ask me this? That's because I love you. His gaze was deep and full of male aggression. She was stunned for a moment. Chapter 1392. He grabbed her hand and looked at her with a burning gaze. Lianxiu, I care because I love you. You can say that I'm overbearing and unreasonable, but I do care. Just thinking about it makes me go crazy. He was conflicted. He wanted to know, but he was afraid that she would say something that would drive him crazy. This was probably how loving someone was, worrying about personal gains and losses. Yi Lianxiu was a little stunned. She hadn't expected him to suddenly show off his affection. She couldn't help but call out softly, Qin Anlin, call me Anlin. His hand slowly moved up along her back and finally landed on her ear. He slowly pinched her slightly red earlobe. You haven't told me the truth yet. His attitude was quite domineering. She was a little shaken and angry. She reached out and hit his shoulder. Qin Anlin, let go of me. But he didn't let go of her. He looked at her even more deeply. You're being naughty again. Her lips parted slightly, and he carried her from the front passenger seat. At this moment, she suddenly realized that their seat belts had been unfastened. She was a little shocked and crashed into his arms. Then she found that their bodies were stuck together in an extremely embarrassing position. If our Lianxiu is not willing to tell me, then I will have to resort to private punishment. Qin Anlin sneered. His slender and good-looking hand slid down her back. Yi Lianxiu bit her lower lip. Her fingers grabbed his shoulder, and his expensive shirt was wrinkled. But he didn't care. He pressed her to his side and whispered in her ear, Lianxiu, are you going to tell me or not? We kissed, she said honestly. Part of her wanted to piss him off. In fact, the kiss between her and Lin Xingyuan was only a light kiss. At most, it was lip-to-lip contact. He didn't dare to be rash, and she wasn't interested in going further. So she didn't want to do it again after 1 or 2 kisses. But she didn't want to tell him. Sure enough, jealous men were irrational. His fingers, which had been gentle, became rough almost at once. Other than the real one, he had never treated her so rudely before. The two of them were in the car, and she was sprawled all over his body. Of course, he could not stand it. She wasn't the only one who couldn't take it. He couldn't either. Qin Anlin leaned against the side of her neck, one hand indulging while the other pressed against her head, lifting her long hair to reveal her face. He searched for her lips and kissed her passionately. Their lips and tongues entangled with each other, so hot that they could almost melt a layer of skin. He groaned in pleasure and switched to a more satisfying angle. Just like that, he kissed her again and again. His palms didn't let go of her either, lifting her up forcefully. I can't take it anymore. He finally moved his lips away. His lips burned behind her ear, and his voice was a little hoarse. Yi Lianxiu opened her eyes and bit her lip. Not here. He coaxed and kissed her. Lianxiu, I can't take it anymore. He brought her fingers to his belt, ready to go. She naturally didn't want to. But no matter how much she struggled, he didn't let go of her. He almost forced her to do it again. Yi Lianxiu lay in his arms and felt an excitement that she had never felt before. Her face was pressed against his shirt, which was covered in hot sweat. Soon, it soaked her face, and her nose was filled with the smell of male hormones. Chapter 1393. Qin Anlin felt hot. He lowered his head to kiss her little mouth and found that she was a little distracted. He grabbed her hand and hung her on his neck. He lowered his head and kissed her passionately, not allowing her to think about anything other than him. Slowly, she became aroused. She raised her head and moved closer to his lips so that they could deepen the kiss. In the middle of the night, the car by the roadside swayed rhythmically, which also disturbed Lin Xingyuan's heart. He looked at it as Adam's apple kept moving. His fingers clenched into fists, and he closed his eyes. The headlights in front shone into their car. He could see Leoncio's intoxicated face, which could almost be regarded as crazy. There was not a trace of blood on his face. He looked at them with an almost masochistic look, a feast that did not belong to him. The kissing in the car and the party in the car were not over yet. But Lin Xingyuan had woken up from his dream. She had never belonged to him. Even if they had been together for 2 years, it would not change anything. People who loved each other would always be together, and people who did not love each other would always be separated. The phone in his pocket rang. He took it out and looked at it. It was a call from Su Chung. He and Su Chung had known each other for a long time. He used to love her very much because she was simple, cute, and lively. But he had never dared to think about her. His family was well off, but it was far from the Su families. But more than 6 years ago, Su Chung suddenly went to his apartment to look for him. In his apartment, he drank some wine and naturally had sex with her. That was Su Cheng's first time. He cherished it very much, but she said that they could only be together in private. She asked him to get close to Yi Lianxiu. At that time, Yi Lianxiu was just popular, but she quickly disappeared. He saw her on the screen and watched it over and over again to study this woman. But what he and Su Chung did not expect was that he fell in love with his target. Getting close to Yi Lianxiu was no longer Su Cheng's task, but his original intention. When Yi Lianxiu appeared in front of him, she was very thin, but he was a doctor. He could tell that she was pregnant with just a few glances. At that time, she was 4 weeks pregnant, and the condition of the child in her womb was not good. He used all his strength to ensure the birth of the child. He had never regretted it. Even now that she was with Qin Anlin, he thought that he still loved her. Lianxiu, from the moment I saw you, I've never been insincere towards you. His feelings for Su Chung were still the same as before. In the past 6 years, they had not slept with each other, except for when she came to see him recently. He barely managed to deal with it twice. He could not let Su Chung suspect that he was in love with Lianxiu. The corners of Lin Xingyuan's lips curled into a bitter smile. Yi Lianxiu had never known that she had long been his everything in life. He stood in the fierce night wind. He couldn't wait for her, but his heart was broken. He picked up the phone and said in a calm tone, "Chung Chung, what's the matter? Why aren't you taking action?" Su Cheng's voice was a little sinister. "Lin Xingyuan, did you fall in love with her?" "How could I?" His tone was very calm, and there was a hint of ridicule in it. It was unknown whether he was talking to Su Chung or himself. Su Cheng's voice was a little sharp. "I don't want to hear your excuses. Lin Xingyuan, I want you to find a way to get Yi Lianxiu back to City H, including me sleeping with her." Lin Xingyuan's voice was cold. Su Chung was stunned. "There's no need for that." Chapter 1394. Su Chung paused before saying, "I think we're working together. I'll give you money." Lin Xingyuan chuckled softly. It was a desolate chuckle that made Su Cheng's heart skip a beat. She said angrily, "Lin Xingyuan, don't you like money?" He was silent for a long time before saying calmly, "What do I need so much money for?" The reason why he agreed was that he wanted to take Lianxiu away. It was better for him to take her away than for Su Chung to hurt her. Su Cheng's voice immediately became soft and cute. "Brother Xingyuan, I know you love me the most. Think about it. You don't want your goddess to marry Anlin Gu either. Think of her panting in Anlin Ji's arms every night and being treated like that by Anlin Gu. Do you think you can't stand it?" Her words struck Lin Xingyuan's heart. He really couldn't stand it. His gaze fell on the car. The torrential rain had already stopped, but she could vaguely see that Qin Anlin was still kissing her from the window. His voice was very indifferent as he said one word, "Okay." After saying that, he walked forward. With every step he took, he felt as though his heart was shattering. It was so dark here that it wasn't suitable for Lianxiu at all. He wanted to take her away. In the car, Qin Anlin cleaned her up gently and then tidied himself up. She was a little shy, still lying in his arms and unwilling to get up. But the more she did so, the softer Qin Anlin's heart became. His cool autumn had always been clean, and he had never done anything else before. Even when he did it in the car, he was so embarrassed. He was even a little reluctant, feeling that she was wronged. He reached out to hug her and patted her back, saying softly, "Don't do this next time." She bit her lip and bit his heart, venting her anger. Cheen Amlin's heart was about to melt. He lowered his head and smiled. "You can bite me all you want when we get back. I'll strip naked and let you bite me?" "Huh? Shameless." She took another bite. "I don't want to treat you like that." He laughed softly. How could he not know that he had just forced himself on her? He reached out to stroke her long, sweaty hair and coaxed her for a long time before he finally coaxed her back. When he got back, he personally helped her bathe and carried her to the bed. Perhaps he was afraid that she would be angry and afraid that she would not be able to take it, so he only dared to act rashly once at that time. He was extremely gentle and didn't care about his own feelings. Everything was for her. Yi Liangqiu could really feel his emotions. This was the most he had ever been in love, and so was she. When she closed her eyes, she could feel him everywhere. However, his gentleness in the night did not last until dawn. He had to go on a business trip for a week, so he woke her up before 6 o'clock. She opened her eyes and was greeted by his handsome facial features. There were also beads of sweat dripping down his face. Almost scalding her, she hit his shoulder with her hand. "Beast!" His muscles were so firm that her hand was hurting. She frowned, and her eyes were watery. "I'm going on a business trip later." He kissed her lips and murmured, "I won't be able to touch you for a week." Her hands were pinned to the sides of her body by him. He worked out regularly, so his body was muscular and his stamina was abnormally good. They couldn't stand his straightforwardness. When she calmed down, she poked his chest. "Don't you still have hands?" Chapter 1395. He looked at her with clear eyes and chuckled after a while. "Liangqiu, a man with a wife doesn't need his hands." She snorted. "You didn't need your hands when you didn't have a wife, did you?" Cheen Amlin's gaze became indescribable. He looked at her with a burning gaze. "Actually, there is." She looked at him in surprise. He had such a harem in the past, and he still needed it? He simply pulled her into his arms and locked her in his arms. As if he was confessing, he said, "Liangqiu, if there are no feelings, even if we do it, that kind of satisfaction is far from enough. Sometimes, he was willing to tell her how he felt and how important she was to him. Sometimes I even think that my hands are cuter." He kissed her lips. "What do you think, Mrs. Cheen? Are you touched?" Yi Liangqiu looked at him and sneered. "Mr. Cheen, I'm sorry. Our values are not on the same level." He actually had the nerve to ask her if she was touched yet. He supported his chin and looked at her. After a while, he chuckled. "I feel pretty good. If you think I need to work on it, I can practice more. After all, I haven't done it for a few years. I'm a little rusty." Yi Liangqiu really wanted to howl. How could he be called rusty? He didn't tease her anymore. He took a shower with her, ate a breakfast made of love, and even shamelessly asked his wife to send him to the company. "Cheen Amlin, you're an adult, and in the whole company, you're the only one sent to work by your wife, right?" She couldn't stand him. In her impression, Cheen Amlin was a rather cold person, especially to women. He wasn't very gentle. When did he become so clingy? Cheen Amlin looked at her and smiled. "Because they don't have a wife as beautiful as you." He looked at her and suddenly remembered something that he didn't explain. He coughed. "Actually, you saw Shun Lian in my bedroom a few years ago, and she didn't do anything." Her body stiffened. She didn't expect him to say that. Cheen Amlin could feel her stiff body. He sighed and hugged her. "Liangqiu, I'm very sorry. I was the one who ran away in the past. I couldn't believe that I fell in love with another woman. I didn't want to be tied down by my feelings." She rested her head on his shoulder and smelled the good scent on his body. She hammered him. "And then you started to be a playboy, right?" She was referring to Pei Chi. Cheen Amlin's body stiffened. He lowered his head and looked at her. "Only you." That was all he said. He did not say anything else. "In the future, I will not mention them again, because they will no longer appear in my life." he said sentimentally. Also, if there's any female celebrity that you don't like, I'll kick her away immediately so that you won't be an eyesore. She squinted at him. Are you willing to do that? There's nothing to be reluctant about. He pinched her face. As long as you're happy. That emo Xiaoqi is fine, she said deliberately. Because Mo Xiaoqi was also the big sister of King Entertainment now, it depended on whether he was willing to let her go. Qin Amlin smiled. I'll get Kam to stop her from working. No need. She was a little peeved. He stroked her long hair. I know you mind. I promise that this won't happen again. Yi Lianqiu didn't say anything. He just lay on Qin Lai's shoulder. After a while, he said softly, if you do that, I'll really leave. Before I leave, I'll give the source of evil. Chapter 1396. Qin Amlin patted her and said in an unprecedentedly gentle voice, Lianqiu, I won't. He then smiled. If that really happens, you won't need it, right? That won't be necessary. She snorted softly and reached out to push him. She said with some disdain, you can go up now, you heartless little thing. He kissed her, and his tone became lingering. Remember to think of me. HM? Yi Lianqiu watched him get out of the car and followed him. He took out his luggage from the trunk and carried it easily. He watched her get out of the car and couldn't help kissing her again. This was the entrance of KNGV Entertainment, and he didn't know how to avoid it. Yi Lianqiu looked at him disapprovingly. He smiled and stroked her hair. Be a good girl and wait for me at home. Don't run around. He sounded like she was a child, which made her feel disgusted. She got into the car and started it. The car drove away quickly, without any reluctance to leave. Qin Amlin stood where he was and took out a cigarette from his pocket. He looked at the back of the car and scolded, you heartless little thing. He had served her so hard these past few days, but she hadn't been touched at all. He turned around and saw Kaim standing at the door with a subtle expression. He didn't know how long she had been standing there. Qin Amlin took a puff of his cigarette and looked at Kaim with narrowed eyes. Kaim's body trembled and she coughed. I just came down. He walked to the door, and the driver's car stopped. He immediately opened the door and said, President Qin, get in the car. The plane is ready. Qin Amlin finished the cigarette, threw it down, and put it out with his calf leather shoes. He strode into the car, and Kaim put his luggage away for him. After getting in the car, Kaim reported the trip to him. President Qin, Mr. Du is holding a banquet for President Qin on the last night. Qin Amlin casually flipped through the itinerary and glanced at Kaim. He smiled faintly and said, that's good too. Kaim looked at his expression and hesitated. What if Mr. Du gives a woman to President Qin? Qin Amlin glanced at Kaim and said calmly, do you need to ask such a question? Kaim instantly felt like an idiot and rubbed his nose. The plane landed at Hong Kong Airport. The black limousine was already waiting outside the airport. Mr. Du was the president of an international entertainment company in Hong Kong. He had known Qin Amlin for many years. This time, no one knew that Qin Amlin was in Hong Kong, especially that old fox, Su Shircheng. Qin Amlin pursed his lips and instructed calmly, release the news that King Entertainment is looking for a strategic partner. Let Su Shircheng think that King Entertainment is having a cash flow problem. Kaim nodded. That sly old fox, Su Shircheng, will definitely find a way to take a bite out of him. I also want to see ATV's strength. Qin Amlin tilted his head. He's so confident in taking down King Entertainment. It's not just because of Su Cheng, right? He always felt uneasy. He always felt that Su Shircheng still had something up his sleeve, especially after his marriage with Su Cheng fell through. Su Shircheng didn't make any special moves, which made him even more suspicious. Kaim nodded. He'll give himself away eventually. Qin Amlin suddenly remembered something. How's Mo Xiaoqi recently? Chapter 1397. Qin Amlin looked down and tapped his fingers on the document. He looked up at Kaim and said calmly, let's put this role aside for now. I'll find another suitable candidate. Kaim was stunned. He immediately realized that Mo Xiaoqi had been frozen by President Qin. Then this role? President Qin, is Missy going to make a comeback? Kim asked cautiously. Qin Amlin looked up at Kim and said, "You're overthinking it. How could he let Liang Xiao make a comeback?" This time, Kim had a rough idea that Mo Xiaoqi had probably offended Yu Liang Xiao. He didn't say anything and drove to the Royal Hong Kong Hotel. Qin Amlin checked into the presidential suite. As soon as he entered, he took off his jacket and threw it on the sofa. Kim was in charge of some basic work, while Qin Amlin took out his phone and called Yu Liang Xiao. It had only been a few hours, but he already missed her. The call went through. Her voice was very gentle. "I'm at Mom's place. I'm here to pick up Mu Yun. I'll go back after lunch." Qin Amlin sat on the sofa and loosened his tie. "I'll be a little busy later. I might have to wait for the night. If it's too late, you can go to bed first. Don't wait for me." Yi Lianxiu snorted. "No one misses you. I know that Lianxiu misses me." He smiled and became serious. "You have to go out in a bit. Be good." Hearing his words, Yi Lianxiu's heart softened. Although she usually said that she hated him, she actually missed him when she heard his voice and couldn't see him. Qin Amlin smiled faintly. "All right, I'm hanging up." "Lianxiu, hang up first." Yi Lianxiu nodded, but didn't hang up immediately. Just listening to the other party's shallow breathing was enough to make him feel sweet. Qin Amlin's heart was a little full. After a long time, he said softly, "Mrs. Qin, this is my first time in a relationship. If there's anything wrong with it, please advise me." Her heart skipped a beat, and she smiled. "Didn't you say that you're an old couple?" "An old couple is also my first love," he said shamelessly. Then, he urged her, "Hurry up and say something nice. I have to go." Her reaction was to hang up the phone. Qin Amlin was disappointed for a long while. Kim came over. "President Qin, we can go now." Kim held a document in his hand. Inside, it was the collaboration plan between King Entertainment and Mr. Du's company. Everything had been prepared by him. No one else had to do it. Qin Amlin looked at his phone again, then got up and picked up his jacket. "Let's go." Kim couldn't help but laugh and followed Qin Amlin out. During the week in Hong Kong, he discussed the details of the cooperation with Mr. Du, although they were friends. A small detail could affect hundreds of millions of dollars, so he couldn't be careless. After a week, both parties reached an agreement, and it was quite pleasant. On the last night, the dinner was held at Ronghua Hotel. Mr. Du hosted the guests personally. The guests were all senior executives of Mr. Du's company. Of course, a man's party couldn't be without beauties. Mr. Du looked at Qin Amlin and said affectionately, "Amlin, why don't you have a drink or two? It's rare for you to come to Hong Kong. Don't you want me to be a good host?" Qin Amlin smiled and covered his glass. "I'm getting married soon. My wife doesn't allow me to drink." Chapter 1398. In fact, he had heard that Qin Amlin was going to marry Yi Liangxiu. Mr. Du admired Yi Liangxiu very much. From the bottom of his heart, he felt that it was a pity that Yi Liangxiu was with Amlin. After all, he knew about Amlin's love history. Mr. Du smiled. "I can't touch alcohol, but I can touch women, right?" Then he looked at Kim. "As long as Kim doesn't say anything, Ms. You won't know, right?" Kim smiled bitterly and looked at Qin Amlin. "Of course she won't say anything." Mr. Du raised his hand. The door of the private room opened, and a beautiful girl walked in. She was in her early 20s, and her temperament was similar to that of Yi Lianxiu when she was young. "Amlin, this is to make up for your past regrets," Mr. Du hinted. "Don't worry, there won't be any trouble." He raised his eyes again and looked at the girl who had just entered. He used his gaze to indicate for her to sit next to Qin Amlin. Qin Amlin just looked at her and didn't say anything. "President Qin, my name is Xia Mian." The girl's voice was soft and very pleasant to the ears. Mr. Du looked at Qin Amlin. "She hasn't graduated from the Chinese Academy of Drama yet." Qin Amlin knew what he meant. She was probably someone Mr. Du found. He smiled faintly. "Let's have dinner together. Forget about the rest." Mr. Du was stunned for a moment. "Why?" Are you not satisfied? Qin Anlin smiled. Of course, Mr. Du's arrangement won't go wrong. But I want to get married. Please forgive me. Mr. Du was stunned for a moment and then laughed. He sighed in a low voice. President Qin has changed. His temperament has changed. Next time, you have to bring your sister-in-law here for me to see. Qin Anlin just smiled and didn't say anything. The dinner continued. Xiao Mian leaned against Qin Anlin. Her soft and young body leaned against Qin Anlin. The fragrance of a young girl floated into his nose. Qin Anlin quietly frowned and excused himself to go to the washroom. He slowly washed his hands clean, his expression somewhat solemn. Mr. Du's action was obviously a test of his loyalty to Lianxiu. He raised his eyes and looked at himself in the mirror. There was a dark look in his eyes. He didn't like people probing him, especially when it was related to Lianxiu. When he returned to the private room, he raised his phone and said, "My wife is checking on me." Mr. Du smiled. "I understand." Qin Anlin sat for a while and then left with Kaim. Before they left, Mr. Du asked them to send Xiao Mian off. Qin Anlin glanced at it and nodded. Kaim didn't want to sit in the back, so he gave the back seat to Xiao Mian. It could be seen that the little girl was still very restrained. Her hands were placed on her knees without moving. Kaim smiled and told the driver to drive. "Where are you staying?" Qin Anlin closed his eyes and suddenly asked. The young girl was wearing an ink-colored dress. Her skin was fair, and she seemed to be scared. She tilted her head and looked at Qin Anlin. Her voice was very soft. "President Qin, you're asking me?" Qin Anlin didn't say anything. Kaim understood and immediately said, "Yes, Miss Xia. We'll send you back first, and then go back to the hotel." Xiao Mian pursed her lips. "I'm staying at the Royal Hotel. I'll go back to be city tomorrow." Kaim turned his head and looked at President Qin. Qin Anlin only raised his eyes and snorted. "What a busybody." Kaim smiled. "Then you can stay in the same hotel. It'll save you the trouble." Xiao Mian bit her lips. "Thank you." Kaim thought that Mr. Du was really generous. He didn't even keep such a top-quality girl for himself. Chapter 1399. The car drove steadily, and the small space was filled with the faint smell of perfume. But more than that, it was the body fragrance of a girl. It was a very pure smell. Even a person like Kaim couldn't help but feel his heart flutter. He sat up straighter and looked at President Qin in the rearview mirror from time to time. President Qin was still calmly resting in the back seat with his eyes closed. Kaim admired Yi Lianxiu more and more. President Qin was like Liu Xiae when he was outside. Half an hour later, the black Rolls-Royce Phantom stopped in front of the Hong Kong Royal Hotel. Kaim got out of the car first and opened the door for Qin Anlin. Out of politeness, he also opened the door for Xiao Mian. Xiao Mian stood under the neon lights, lowered her eyes, and then looked up again. Her long eyelashes fluttered, and it was a little breathtaking. "Thank you, President Qin." She smiled at Kaim. "And thank you." Kaim thought to himself, "Wow, she's a sensible girl." Fortunately, President Qin isn't tempted, or else he'll be pestered by her. Qin Anlin had been calm the whole time. He nodded and walked towards the hotel lobby. Kaim hurriedly followed and even waved at Xiao Mian. Xiao Mian stood where she was, pursed her lips, and slowly followed. The elevator mercilessly closed in front of her. She looked at the exclusive elevator that went straight to the presidential suite on the top floor. This was the hierarchy. It was like this elevator, and she would never be able to enter it. Kaim stood in the elevator and looked at Qin Anlin. After a long time, he said softly, "Do you think Mr. Du is trustworthy, President Qin?" "Half." Qin Anlin put his hand on his forehead and raised his face, looking a little tired. Kaim couldn't help but lower his voice. "The private plane will fly directly to be city tomorrow morning. President Qin, you should rest first." Kaim stayed in the second bedroom, and he went in first. Qin Anlin sat on the sofa for a while, then took out his phone and looked at it. There were no calls, no text messages, nothing. This heartless little thing. But even though he was angry, he still felt a little sweet. Qin Amlin sent a message over. "What are you doing?" There was a quick reply from the other side. "Help Mu Yin finish bathing." As long as Qin Amlin thought of her wet clothes, his heart would ripple. He didn't care that it was past 10 o'clock and called her. It rang a few times before he picked it up. Qin Amlin smiled faintly. "Lianxiu," Yi Lianxiu said vaguely. "I'm about to take a shower." "Not wearing clothes?" He was immediately interested. Yi Lianxiu slid into the bathtub and sighed comfortably. At the same time, his Adam's apple rolled, and his voice was extremely hoarse. "Lianxiu, what's the matter?" She lifted her leg and gently splashed the water with her other hand. Qin Amlin listened to the sound of water, and his body tensed up. "I miss you." "What do you miss?" Compared to his excitement, Yi Lianxiu was a little indifferent. But these 4 words made Qin Amlin excited, and he even began to speak incoherently. "I miss you everywhere, especially little Anlin. Pervert." She snorted and told him about Mu Yun's situation today. He listened carefully without the slightest impatience, although he wanted to hear her say something nice. He loosened his tie and smiled lightly. "I'll talk to him when I come back." She was also silent for a while. In such a late night, they both tasted the taste of missing each other. Chapter 1400. Yi Lianxiu looked up and said softly, "Then stay in Hong Kong for a few more days." He chuckled. "Well, Mr. Du gave me a girl tonight. Lianxiu, if I stay a few more days, I don't know if I can control myself." Yi Lianxiu sat up slowly and snorted. "It's okay if you don't want to control yourself. Are you angry?" His eyes were full of intoxicating smiles as he coaxed her patiently. Coaxing her like this made his heart soften. He wanted her to be angry. The angrier she was, the more she cared about him. "When we go back, can you punish me? You can do whatever you want. Tie me up, beat me, whatever," he said shamelessly. His mind was also a little excited because of his excessive imagination. Yi Lianxiu couldn't stand him anymore. She was about to hang up when Qin Amlin said in a low voice, "Wait. The doorbell is ringing." She didn't hang up the phone when he said that. Her female intuition told her that something might have happened. For example, President Qin's love affair. Qin Amlin walked to the door with his phone in hand. He opened the door and saw Xia Mian wearing only a bathrobe. Her black hair was a little wet, and it was draped over her shoulders as if she was taking a bath. The translucent bathrobe was half hanging on her young body. It was midnight, and it was indescribably tempting. "President Qin, the shower in my room is broken. Can you take a look at it for me?" Xia Mian covered her breasts with her white fingers. Men always like this kind of hesitation the most. Qin Amlin frowned slightly and said to Yi Lianxiu on the phone, "Wait." As he spoke, he opened the door wide and called for Kaim. Kaim walked out. At first, he looked at Xia Mian in surprise, but then he understood. "Go to Miss Xia's room and take a look." Qin Amlin's tone was a little indifferent. "Also, get another room. If Miss Xia needs anything, she can come to you directly." Kaim could hear the displeasure in his boss's voice. Xia Mian was obviously rejecting President Qin's offer, and he was chatting with his wife. Why did she have to butt in? Kaim nodded. "All right." He went back to the bedroom to get his things. Xia Mian's face was a little embarrassed. She pulled her clothes tighter and said, "Sorry for disturbing you." Qin Amlin was not polite to her. He said directly, "It's good that Miss Xia knows it." Xia Mian took a deep breath. "Let's not bother Kaim. I'll talk to the front desk." After that, Qin Amlin closed the door. "Did you hear that?" He said to the other side of the phone. "Mrs. Qin, I'm a good girl, aren't I? I didn't call anyone else." Yi Lianxiu snorted coldly. "President Qin, my shower is also broken. Can you come and take a look?" He chuckled. "Come back tomorrow morning, huh?" On the other side of the phone, he hung up. Qin Amlin looked at the phone and smiled. What a bad temper. But even so, he still liked it. Walking to the door of Kaim's bedroom, he said calmly, "Set the flight to 6 in the morning tomorrow." Kaim was a little surprised, but she still nodded. "I'll arrange it." Qin Amlin went back to his bedroom. He took a shower and lay on the bed for a while. He tossed and turned, but he couldn't fall asleep. After leaving Qiuqiu, his insomnia came again. After a long time, he sat up and wanted to drink a glass of wine out of habit. But thinking of the child, he resisted the urge. Chapter 1401. She might have fallen asleep. It took her about half an hour to reply, and during this half an hour, he waited foolishly. I'm asleep. These two words could melt his heart. He couldn't bear to let go of her. Can you chat with me? Well, what gift did you bring me? Isn't myself the best gift? After a long while, she replied with a few words. Shameless. Qin Amlin knew that she was extremely sleepy. His heart was sweet and sour at the same time. There was a woman knocking on his door just now, but she could actually sleep so peacefully. Did she trust him, or did she not care? Qin Amlin was furious, but that heartless little thing had already fallen asleep. He stayed by his phone for a long time, looking at it helplessly. But this kind of helplessness was sweet. He got up and went to the gym for 2 hours. At least he slept for 3 or 4 hours. He set off for the airport at dawn. Poor Kime, who was still asleep, dragged his luggage and followed his CEO. It was only 8 o'clock in the morning when they arrived in B City. Qin Amlin opened the door of the house. The house was still quiet. She probably hadn't woken up yet. He put down his luggage, walked into the bedroom, and watched her and little Mu Yun sleeping head to head. His heart softened. After watching for a long time, he took off his coat, untied his tie, and rolled it in his hand. He walked over lightly, gently carried her body, and walked straight out of the bedroom. Yi Lianqiu woke up. When she opened her eyes, she saw his slightly depressed face. She reached out and hugged him, still a little sleepy. You're back so early? Yeah. He rubbed the tip of his nose against hers. After a long while, he said softly, I missed you. He carried her into the guest room and threw her on the bed, not too gently. He knelt on one knee beside her, held her face with one hand, and kissed her. She finally woke up and looked up at him. What's wrong with you? Suddenly, her hand was tied by the tie and tied to the headboard. Qin Amlin. She was a little angry and glared at him. However, he comforted her and coaxed her softly. Be good, don't move around. She kicked at him, but he quickly held her leg down and looked deep into her eyes. Yi Lianqiu bit her lip. Weren't you satisfied last night? He chuckled softly and tied her up tightly. Then, he straightened his body and admired her struggling and helpless look. He reached out a hand and gently caressed her blushing face. What should I use to satisfy you? His slender fingers pinched her face, almost deforming it. Yi Lianqiu kicked him angrily and glared at him. She had never been in such a difficult situation. They were not even married yet, and he was already playing this kind of game. Seeing the look in her eyes, Qin Amlin chuckled and kissed her shamelessly. I don't have those problems that you think I have, but Lianqiu, looking at you, I can't help but want to do this. Excuses. She kicked him again and again, but her voice was soft. You're obviously a pervert. Yes, I'm a pervert. He lowered his head and kissed her. His slender hands held her hand to prevent her from hurting herself. They kissed like this for a long time. When he looked up at her, her eyes were filled with moisture and looked very tempting. Did you miss me? His fingers rubbed her delicate red lips, and his voice was extremely hoarse. Her long hair was scattered on the pillow. She looked at him hopelessly, and her lips were trembling slightly. Baby, say you missed me. His heart was also a little excited, and there was a flame burning in his dark eyes, as if he wanted to eat her up. Chapter 1402. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. She looked like she was about to die. Qin Amlin lowered his head and kissed her earlobe. He said in a low voice, Hurry up and say you missed me. Yi Lianqiu looked at him and said stubbornly, I don't. She tried to kick him again, but he held her down firmly. His eyes were so bright that he looked as though he wanted to devour her whole, After a long while, he said in a hoarse voice, "How should I punish you for being so naughty?" After a long while, her pajamas were rolled up to her thighs, which was extremely seductive. Cheen Amlin propped himself up and moved down slowly. She lay there in a pathetic state, watching him do whatever he wanted to her. The saying that absence makes the heart grow fonder was not wrong at all. Cheen Amlin was more excited than ever before. He was even willing to die on top of her. When it was the hottest, he would let out a sexy moan. She closed her eyes and listened to him. She had never known that a man could make such a pleasant moan. The door opened quietly. Mu Yun, who was wearing a onesie, walked in quietly and climbed onto the bed. He hugged Cheen Amlin's waist from behind. "Daddy?" Cheen Amlin's body froze. He was at a loss for words. He cursed under his breath and suppressed his burning desire. He covered Yi Lianxiu with a blanket and turned around to look at his son. In his heart, he wanted to cry. Did he still want a younger brother or sister? He exhaled deeply and calmed himself down. He forced a smile and said, "Mu Yun is awake?" Little Mu Yun looked at his father's face and felt that it was a little twisted. Did he disturb something? Yi Lianxiu was covered under the blanket. She could not move her hands and felt suffocated. She could only say weakly, "Cheen Amlin, let go of me." He glanced at her, then immediately untied her hands. Little Mu Yun looked at his father's tie and asked curiously, "Why did you tie mommy up?" Yi Lianxiu was wrapped in the quilt, and her body was still trembling slightly. She stared at Cheen Amlin and asked him to explain such a shameful thing. Cheen Amlin tugged at the blanket. She was still wrapped tightly, not giving him a single piece of cloth to cover up his private parts. Yi Lianxiu. The father was annoyed and glared at her. The main reason was that he hadn't vented his anger yet, so he wasn't in a good mood. Yi Lianxiu ignored him, wrapped herself in the quilt, and went back to the master bedroom, leaving him alone to face his precocious son and educate him about sex. Little Mu Yun's gaze was attracted by something, and he stared at it for a long time. Cheen Amlin didn't know how to explain it to his son. He thought about it and coughed. "Mom's back hurts. Dad is helping her loosen her muscles." Little Mu Yun looked somewhere else and asked slowly, "Do I need to take off my clothes?" This Cheen Amlin touched his nose. "It's not easy to massage with clothes on. How about I give you a massage too?" Yi Mian looked at him as if he was a pervert for a while, and then said with disgust, "I don't want to." The excitement of looking at his father disappeared after looking at that horrible thing. Little Mu Yun left with little interest, leaving Cheen Amlin, who came back from Hong Kong early in the morning. When everyone was gone, he looked down at himself. It seemed that he didn't want to do anything else during the day. He resigned himself to his fate and got up to take a shower. With a touch of dissatisfaction, he went to the kitchen. Yi Lianxiu was already cooking breakfast in the kitchen. Chapter 1403. Cheen Amlin felt that his heart had been rekindled. He walked over and hugged her from behind. He rested his face on her shoulder and held her hand. "What are you doing?" Mu Yun likes to eat a kind of pancake these days. As soon as she finished speaking, she felt itchy on her neck. She turned her head and patted him. "Behave yourself. Mu Yun will be here again in a while." His hand slid down her arm, acting a little unruly. "I'm not doing anything." Why was he sticking so close to her? Yi Lianxiu glanced at him and continued to make breakfast. Cheen Amlin had no choice but to give up. However, he felt sorry for her when he saw the faint bruises on her arm. "Why did you hurt yourself?" Yi Lianxiu turned her face and glanced at him. "What do you think?" He laughed again, a little complacent. With such a beautiful wife, what more could he ask for? He held her waist and whispered in her ear, "I really want the shirt back." He rubbed against her and whispered, "We can continue at night. Or you can coax him to sleep at noon, okay?" "I won't coax him." Her voice was as sweet as honey, and his heart melted. He nibbled on her jade-like neck for a while before he chuckled again. "Then I'll coax him. I've promised Mu Yin to take him out to play today." She turned her head and played with his good-looking chin with her fingers. Cheen Amlin grabbed her hand and narrowed his eyes. "You know that I'm coming back today, but you still took him out. What are you up to? She only smiled and didn't speak. Qin Amlin pinched her face. I'll teach you a lesson tonight. As soon as he finished speaking, he held her waist with one hand. The pancake is going to be burnt. She was brought into his arms, and he took over her work with alacrity. Just like that, they leaned on each other and made breakfast together. It felt very warm. Qin Amlin was a carnivore, but before he ate meat, he was willing to let his little animals out. Therefore, he accompanied the mother and son for the whole day. Unlike other children, little Mu Yun didn't like to go to the amusement park. He liked to go to the study room to read. Often, he could look at it for an entire morning. In the end, little Mu Yun was reading, his mother was looking at him, and his father was looking at his mother like a fool. The scene was very intoxicating. However, the peace of the family of three was soon disturbed. A gentle voice sounded, President Qin. Qin Amlin looked up and saw that it was Xia Mian. He nodded lightly. Miss Xia. There was a faint blush on Xia Mian's face. She seemed to be excited about the chance encounter, but at the same time, she was a little uneasy. She looked at Yi Liangxiu, who was sitting beside Qin Amlin. Her expression was a little subtle, but she didn't ask. The magnetic field between women was very subtle. Yi Liangxiu wasn't a fool. Naturally, she could feel that the little girl in front of her didn't like her. She raised her head and looked at Qin Amlin. Do you need to avoid me? Avoid what? We just know each other. Qin Amlin kissed and pinched her face. But he had a bad feeling in his heart. His little Qiu seemed to be jealous. With her intelligence, she must have guessed Xia Mian's identity. But he was also curious. Xia Mian returned to B City so soon and coincidentally met him. Was it a coincidence? Xia Mian raised her hand to look at the time and smiled. President Qin, thank you for driving me back to the hotel last night and taking me in. How about this? I'll treat you to dinner. There was more or less a touch of ambiguity in her words, which was unclear. Chapter 1404. How could she say that she wasn't jealous when her expression changed? He smiled in his heart, put his hand on Yi Liangqiu's shoulder, and said calmly, We just met by chance, so let's forget about it. Back in Hong Kong, he did it out of respect for Mr. Du and B City. If it weren't for the fact that he wanted to establish a friendly image in front of Liangqiu, he wouldn't have even looked at Xia Mian. Of course, he also had other dark thoughts, which was to make his cute little Liangqiu jealous. Seeing her jealous expression made him feel especially good. Xia Mian was a little embarrassed after being rejected. Her face froze for a while before she said, Missy can come with us. Qin Amlin put his arm around Yi Liangqiu's neck. She's not Miss Yi, she's my wife. Xia Mian forced a smile. Mrs. Qin, nice to meet you. Yi Liangqiu just smiled faintly, not very friendly. She didn't need to be nice to a woman who had ulterior motives towards her man. Xia Mian was a little embarrassed, so she turned around to find the book she wanted. Yi Liangqiu noticed that the book she picked was called An Actor's Self-Cultivation. She smiled and stood up with Qin Amlin's arm. I'm going to the bathroom. Qin Amlin nodded and patted the back of her hand. We'll go eat when you come back. There was a hint of mockery in her eyes, and Qin Amlin immediately understood. He patted her butt. Naughty! Only then did Yi Liangqiu walk to the bathroom. She stood in front of the sink and slowly scrubbed her hands. She was thinking about the person just now, but as she was thinking about it, that person was standing beside her. Miss Xia! Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Xia Mian also called out, Missy, I know you. Yi Liangqiu heard the way Xia Mian called her, so she could naturally feel the sharpness in Xia Mian's voice. She smiled carelessly. Didn't Amlin introduce me to you just now? Xia Mian raised her chin slightly. No. The Missy I know is an actress, and I will be an actress like you in the future. Yi Liangqiu calmly continues to wash her hands and chuckles. Miss Xia, I want you to stand beside me and talk to me now. Not because I am an actress, but because I am Qin Amlin's wife, right? Xia Mian's voice was low. But he's not married to you yet. There are plenty of people who want to replace him. Do you think he's still single in his 30s because he's waiting for you to appear? Yi Lianxiu smiled. Do you know how many trainees King Entertainment has every year? It's not like there aren't any who are younger and better looking than you. Didn't Miss Yi climb into President Qin's bed like this? Xiao Mian's tone was a little stubborn and aggressive. Yi Lianxiu chuckled. So that's how it is? How about this? I'll ask Amlin for you and ask him if he's willing. Is that okay, Miss Xia? She was polite, gentle, and not aggressive at all. But Xiao Mian was beaten to the point of retreat. No matter how you looked at it, her current situation and role were immoral. Yi Lianxiu stood on the moral high ground. Xiao Mian pursed her lips and finally left. Looking at the direction in which she left, Yi Lianxiu was in a daze. With Qin Amlin's wealth, status, and appearance, girls like Xiao Mian would continue to throw themselves at him in the future. It was impossible to stop them. It mainly depended on what Qin Amlin thought. She wasn't afraid. She had lost many things, so she wasn't afraid of losing. Chapter 1405. When she walked out and saw him, she couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. In a corner where there was no one around, she leaned on his shoulder and bit him hard. Are you a puppy? He let out a muffled groan and pulled her little face closer to his, kissing her lips in an instant. Yi Lianxiu fiercely bit down on his lips. Even though he tasted a trace of blood, he did not let go of her and continued to kiss her. When he left her lips, he licked his lips contentedly. What lipstick did you put on today? It's quite sweet. Yi Lianxiu glared at him. Qin Amlin, all right, I know you're angry, but I promise I didn't touch a single hair on her, nor did I go to her room. Khan could testify. He raised his finger jokingly. Yi Lianxiu couldn't be bothered with him. She picked up little Mu Yun and said, let's go for dinner. He couldn't bear to see her suffer, so he took his son and they walked out side by side. He carried his son with one hand and opened the car door for her to get in before passing his son to her. He was very careful with his movements, afraid that Mu Yun would get hurt. Yi Lianxiu could tell that he treated her and Mu Yun very well. Besides liking them, he was probably trying to make it up to them. Her heart was still a little shaken, but when she saw him getting into the car, she felt more honest than ever. This person seemed to really love her. Qin Amlin closed the car door and glanced at her. He smiled. What's wrong? Nothing. I just think that your back view is very handsome. She stuck out her tongue after saying that, disgusted by herself. Qin Amlin started the car. When he bent his arms, his muscles bulged slightly, which was very attractive. She got a little distracted as she looked at him. His shameless words came into her ears. Lianxiu, being captivated by your own husband is not a shameful thing. I think you should be loyal to your own feelings in Yuang. Mr. Qin, not yet. She reminded him. He smiled and turned the steering wheel with one hand. Soon, they would be married in half a month. As for the time being, they would still be living in the apartment. However, he was already looking for a villa garden, and it would be another half a year before he could move in. The place had been chosen, and he would bring Lianxiu there in 2 days. Qin Amlin had never longed for marriage so much. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to have a woman invade his space. But Lianxiu was different. She had long invaded his life. The first time, he had rejected her. The second time, when she was with Mu Yun, he felt that it was so natural. It was as if they were his wives, his children. Qin Amlin's heart softened, and he looked at her in the rearview mirror. Little Mu Yun was lying on Yi Lianxiu's lap. He seemed to be tired. He closed his eyes. He looked very good. At this moment, he was like a little angel. When they arrived at the intersection, he stopped the car and handed his coat to the back. Cover him. Be careful not to catch a cold. Yi Lianxiu was stunned and looked up at him. For the first time, she felt that when a man became a father, it was so sexy. She gently took it and covered little Mu Yun. Soft music flowed slowly in the car, and Qin Amlin's voice was also very gentle. Lianxiu, let's have another child. Shall we? She nodded. Whether it was for Mu Yun or their marriage, she was willing to have another child. She wanted that child to grow up in fatherly and motherly love, so that little Mu Yun would have a younger brother or sister. Chapter 1406. Lin Xingyuan called a week later, which happened to be the second day after Qin Anlin came back. He went to the company, and Mu Yun was also picked up by Lady Qin. When it was almost noon, Qin Anlin called and asked his wife to send him a lunch. Usually, Qin Anlin felt a little bored during the 2-hour lunch break. Yi Lianxiu didn't believe that it was to send him a lunch. He wanted her to send him to his office. She even suspected that he had arranged for Lady Qin to pick up Mu Yun. She usually didn't care about Mr. Qin's shameless behavior and unrestrained way of doing things. He wasn't tired, but she was. As soon as she hung up, Lin Xingyuan called. Yi Lianxiu looked at the number, moved her fingers slightly, and finally picked it up. As soon as she opened her mouth, her voice was a little hoarse. Xingyuan. On the other side, Lin Xingyuan was a little bitter. Lianxiu, let's have lunch together. I'm going back to H City in the afternoon. Logically or emotionally, she couldn't refuse. Yi Lianxiu thought for a moment. Let's have lunch at the Wind Shelter Hall. Is 12 o'clock okay? Lin Xingyuan nodded. Okay. When she put down the phone, Yi Lianxiu's heart was heavy, and she didn't come back to herself for a long time. After a long time, she smiled, looked at the time, changed her clothes, and prepared to go out. She originally wanted to report to Qin Anlin, but thinking of his vinegar bucket, she gave up. She still drove the white BMW. When she arrived at the restaurant, Lin Xingyuan was already there. At first glance, she felt that he seemed to have lost weight. Yi Lianxiu smiled slightly, walked over and sat down, and the waiter immediately poured a glass of water for her. Have you been here for a long time? She took a sip of water to hide her uneasiness. From an emotional point of view, she owed him. Lin Xingyuan smiled, holding his own cup with his fingers and turning it gently. Not long ago. He raised his eyes and said to the waiter, "Serve the dishes." After the waiter left, Yi Lianxiu asked softly, "Aren't you going to stay for a few more days?" Lin Xingyuan looked at her deeply and chuckled. "I didn't find a reason for myself." Yi Lianxiu looked at him, her voice a little soft. "Xingyuan, let's not talk about that. Let's have a good meal as a farewell." His tone was a little desolate. "Lianxiu, love is selfish. You don't need to feel guilty." The atmosphere was a little stiff, which was what she had expected. Slowly, she removed the necklace from her neck. "Xingyuan, I might not be able to accept this." Lin Xingyuan lowered his eyes and looked at it for a long time. He forced a smile and said, "Keep it, Lianxiu. Just treat it as a memory. Just treat it as a memory of the days we spent together." She looked at him and gently placed the necklace in his palm. "Xingyuan, I hope that you can forget about it and let it go. In everyone's heart, there's an emotion that can't be erased." I met you, a very beautiful you. Xingyuan, I hope that one day you can also meet your Lin Xingyuan. At that time, don't wait for Yi Lianxiu anymore. Be with her. She felt that it was cruel to say these words, but she would rather him let it go and forget about it. It was better than being in pain all the time. She really couldn't delay him anymore. She had tried to love him, but their relationship stopped at being very close friends. Lin Xingyuan's gaze was deep. He slowly reached out his hand and put it on the back of her hand. His voice was very soft. "Lianxiu, I will remember the 2 years we spent together." Chapter 1407. There was a darkness in his heart that she didn't know about. That place had long been rotten. When he looked at her, he would feel inferior because he had a motive for getting close to her from the start. How could someone like him deserve her love? When the waiter served the dishes, he drank the iced water and served the dishes to her from time to time, but he ate very little himself. He looked up and watched as Yi Lianxiu drank the water in the glass. His gaze became even deeper. Yi Lianxiu only felt that something was wrong after lunch. She looked down and felt a little sleepy as she slowly laid down on the table. Lin Xingyan looked at her for a long time before he carried her out. Everyone looked at him, and his expression was indifferent. This was the last time he would carry her. Lianxiu, you have to walk your own path from now on. My intentions towards you, my love for you, and those unspeakable darkness will all be gone with the wind. I only woke up after seeing how much you love him. Wanting to get you was just a dream. How could I deserve someone like that? In a high-end suite in a hotel, he looked down at her sleeping face. She was sleeping soundly because she had half a sleeping pill. Lianxiu, sleep. Have a good sleep. Everything will be perfect when you wake up. Those who want to deal with you, the darkness will leave you. He caressed her face with his fair fingers and smiled. Lianxiu, I liked you from the first time I saw you. She was in a deep sleep and couldn't hear a single word he said. Lin Xingyuan lowered his head and kissed her forehead. Lianxiu, I have to leave. He smiled bitterly. You said to let go and forget, but I hope that you will always remember that there was a person called Lin Xingyuan in your life. I can't hurt you, and I can't face being exposed by Su Cheng. So, Lianxiu, I can only help you find happiness. He looked at her deeply for a long time before he finally got up. His phone rang, and he picked it up. I'll be done soon. I'll come over to look for you later. The person on the other side laughed a few times weirdly, then asked in an even weirder voice, You didn't really touch her, did you? Of course not. Lin Xingyuan remained expressionless. Cheng, you are the only one in my heart. Su Cheng giggled. I'm downstairs at the hotel. Lin Xingyuan put down his phone and quietly looked at Yi Lianxiu for a few seconds. In the end, he still steeled his heart and went out. The elevator went down floor by floor. He dialed Qin Anlin's cell phone. Lianxiu is in Regent Hotel room 1212. With that, he hung up the phone. This place was very close to Qin Anlin's company. After Qin Anlin arrived, the reporters that Su Cheng hired would swarm over and capture the scene of Yi Lianxiu secretly eating. This was what Su Cheng wanted, and he, Lin Xingyuan, had changed the ending. When he arrived at the hotel, he did not see Su Cheng. His heart tightened. He opened the car door and saw her sitting in the front passenger seat. Su Cheng wore a pair of sunglasses on her small face. She looked at Lin Xingyuan and opened her palm. Where is it? Lin Xingyuan placed the phone in her hand and said calmly, I took a picture according to your request. She is not wearing any clothes right now. Su Cheng calmly played with her phone and glanced at Lin Xingyuan. That means you saw her body? Lin Xingyuan started the car and did not answer her. Chapter 1408. No. Lin Xingyuan's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. Su Cheng's gaze fell upon his hand. She looked at the bulging veins on his hand and saw the slight amount of sweat on it. Brother Xingyuan, tell me, what did you do? Su Cheng's voice was sweet, causing one's hair to stand on end. Lin Xingyuan narrowed his eyes and stepped on the accelerator. He said in a calm tone, If I tell you that I cut the car's brakes, Cheng, will you be afraid? Su Cheng let out a long, oh. So, you like her so much that you are willing to die for her and betray me? Su Cheng placed her hand on his shoulder and breathed into his ear. Back then, when you held my naked body, you said that I am the one you love the most in your life. So, Cheng, let's die together. Lin Xingyuan turned his head and smiled at her. He was still gentle and elegant, still the Lin Xingyuan she knew in the past. However, she had never been able to see him clearly and understand him. Su Cheng smiled as well. Brother Xingyuan, if you want to die, I can grant you your wish. At that moment, the car had deviated from the runway and it slid down the slope of the suburbs. There was no one around. A knife appeared in Su Cheng's hand, and she forcefully stabbed it into Lin Xingyuan's abdomen. Blood dyed his white shirt red, and his face was pale. The scene of the car being driven at high speed, the murder within the car, and his expression of fear became like a long scene in a movie. It stretched out, and finally stopped. You want to kill me? You're not good enough. Su Cheng pushed her hand forward again, tightening her grip. Lin Xingyuan's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. The car had lost control, and his lips curled into a dazed smile. You won't survive either. Su Cheng's foot slammed down on the brakes. After a series of pulleys, the car came to a screeching halt. Su Cheng's hand twisted madly. Brother Xingyun, this bit of skill of yours is not enough for me, in? Lin Xingyuan looked at Shenin in pain, but this could not stop Su Cheng. She stabbed him again and again. Why did you betray me? Do you know that those who betray me will not have a good ending? Her hands and body were covered in blood, but she was fearless. She felt an indescribable pleasure. She killed, yes, she killed, he deserved to die. He had already said that he loved her, so why did he have to give up and love someone else? He deserved to die. Su Cheng wiped the blood off the knife and got out of the car. She used an oil bucket to fetch a bucket of oil from the car and poured it over the car. Lin Xingyuan sat there dripping with blood, not moving at all. His fingers were already hanging down. Su Cheng threw his phone into the car. She was about 5 meters away from the car and threw the lighter beside the car. The gasoline immediately ignited, and the flames soared into the sky, exploding, shattering into pieces. As for Lin Xingyuan, he had completely disappeared from this world. Qin Amlin rushed to the Regent Hotel and kicked the door open. At that time, his heart almost stopped. He walked over step by step. His Lianqiu was lying well, and there was nothing wrong with her body. He reached out to help her up and shook her awake. Lianqiu, Yi Lianqiu slowly opened her eyes. Her head was still a little dizzy, and the person in front of her also made her a little dazed. Amlin, she shook her head. I was eating with Xingyuan. Why was he here? Qin Amlin hugged her and said in a low voice, It's good that you were fine. Chapter 1409. Yi Lianqiu reached out to take it. After flipping through a few pages, her expression changed. She looked up at Qin Amlin and said, I want to call Lin Xingyuan. It was probably because she had lived with Lin Xingyuan for 2 years. She knew him very well, and his current actions made her feel a sense of farewell. She hurriedly made the call, while Qin Amlin flipped through his diary. It was written very vaguely. Most of it was about Lin Xingyuan and Yi Lianqiu's life in the past 2 years. Even when they had breakfast, it was written in detail. That kind of sweet and sour feeling with a tinge of bitterness could be felt just by looking at it. He turned to the last page, and there was only one line. Do you know, Yi Lianqiu? Yi Lianqiu tried desperately to call him, but she couldn't get through. She was about to cry, and her heart was cold. Lin Xingyuan, what have you done? I won't allow you to do this, however. His phone had been turned off, and she couldn't reach him. At this moment, the door of the suite was broken in, and a large number of reporters came in. They wanted to capture the scene of Yi Lianqiu climbing the wall, but the person sitting by the bed was Qin Amlin. The scene suddenly went out of control. Qin Amlin was angry, and the reporters were excited. Yi Lianqiu desperately walked out. She wanted to find Lin Xingyuan. Her intuition told her that something had happened. However, the reporters blocked in front of her and asked frantically. Qin Amlin protected her and took her out, but there were too many reporters, and he couldn't do anything. In the end, the hotel manager came out and asked the reporters to leave. Yi Lianqiu held the diary in her hand. Amlin, please find him. Qin Amlin held her shoulder and nodded calmly. I will. She didn't look well, and he was worried. In the end, he called Ing Jie to take care of her. He arranged for someone to find Lin Xingyuan. There was no record of Lin Xingyuan returning to H City from the high-speed rail or the airport, which meant that he was still in the city. Qin Amlin would think that Lianqiu was overthinking if there was no reporter incident. But after the reporter incident, this matter was not so simple. Behind them, there was a hand that they could not see. Until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, all the mainstream media were reporting a piece of news. An Audi Q5 exploded and burned on a national highway, and there was an adult man in the car. According to the license plate number, the identity of the man was inferred to be Dr. Lin Xingyuan of H City. Yi Lianqiu sat on the sofa in the apartment. The moment she saw Lin Xingyuan, she burst into tears. Xingyuan is dead? How could that charred body belong to Lin Xingyuan? How could it be the Lin Xingyuan who bought her breakfast every day and came home early from work? He was such a good person. How could he just leave like that? She did not believe it. Qin Anlin hugged her from behind, and his voice was a little hoarse. Lianxiu, cry if you want. Just cry it out. Her face was buried in his arm, and her voice was extremely hoarse. It can't be Xing Yuan. Qin Anlin, tell me it can't be him. Xing Yuan won't die. They had promised each other that he would find a good woman to marry. How could he die? How could he die? She cried like a child. She had lost him again. She had lost the most important person in her life. There was no way to make it up. When she fell asleep, he had gone to another world. Qin Anlin hugged her tightly, not letting her hurt herself. His face was pressed against her cold little face. It was cold and wet, and tears were everywhere. It was her heartbreak. He could understand. Chapter 14:10. Qin Anlin was startled. He hugged her properly and called her name. She was still unconscious. In the end, he still carried her and drove to the hospital. To his surprise and joy, Liang Xiu was pregnant. He reached out and gently stroked her belly. This child came at the right time. It was just the right time to heal the pain in her heart. It wasn't the right time because he was afraid that she would be too sad and hurt the child and herself. Qin Anlin's heart was extremely conflicted. It was sweet and sour at the same time. He didn't know how to treat her well to make her a little happier. He asked Kime to handle Lin Xingyuan's matter. No matter what, Lin Xingyuan was an important person to Lianxiu, and he had taken care of them for so many years. Kime came over. It was a homicide, but we can't find the murderer. The killer is too cunning. He chose to burn the car and destroyed all the clues. We only know that the murder weapon was a fruit knife. Qin Anlin stood in the hospital corridor with him. He looked at Kime for a while and took out a cigarette. Where is Lin Xingyuan? Kime pursed his lips and sighed. He's changed beyond recognition. He's quite pitiful. Qin Anlin looked out the window with a distant gaze. There must be a story and a person behind Lin Xingyuan. What was that story in that person? Who was it? Back in the ward, he continued to watch over her, and Kime went to continue to gather information. When Yi Lianxiu woke up, it was already dark. She slowly opened her eyes, and Qin Anlin immediately leaned over. Are you feeling better? Are you hungry? Mom asked Annie Xiu to send some nourishing soup over. Yi Lianxiu felt her lips were a bit dry. She licked them and looked at Qin Anlin in front of her. She said with difficulty, Anlin, I want to find Xing Yuan. She was worried about Xing Yuan. But as soon as she finished speaking, she recalled the previous news, and her face turned pale again. She struggled to get up, but was stopped by Qin Anlin. He looked straight into her eyes, and his tone couldn't be more serious. Lianxiu, I won't stop you if you want to go crazy, and I won't be jealous either. But we have to protect our children. His large palm caressed her lower abdomen, and Yi Lianxiu was stunned. She looked at Qin Anlin for a long time before she asked with difficulty, Child? Yes. He held her in his arms and said in a very gentle voice, Yes, Lianxiu, we have another child. She hesitantly placed her fingers on her lower abdomen. She had another child so soon? His gaze slowly met his. Anlin, can you let me see Xing Yuan? He hugged her, letting her feel the warmth of his body. After a long time, he finally nodded. Okay. He knew that not letting her see him would be the regret of her life. Although she was pregnant and shouldn't see these things, she was pregnant with Qin Anlin's child. His child wasn't afraid of these things. He didn't need to be afraid of Lin Xingyuan. He felt that Lin Xingyuan loved Liangxiu with his life. Then he didn't need to be afraid. He took Yi Liangxiu to that cold place, and he accompanied her. When she saw Lin Xingyuan, an extremely uncomfortable liquid rose from her stomach, and she immediately covered her mouth with her hand. She ran out and vomited so much that she almost threw up her bile because it was too scary. Too scary. Xingyuan didn't have a good ending. That scene had been entrenched in her mind, and it became her nightmare. For this, Lady Qin blamed Qin Anlin and scolded him. Liangxiu is pregnant. How could you take her to such a gloomy place? What if she got scared? You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.